Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I'm Reed Coverdale, and you're watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I've got my friend Dack Rouleau back on the show again. How we doing, Dack?
Good. I know that there are people who, when they see me come on, they either know whether they're going to shut it off right away or whether they're going to sit through the whole thing. So it's good to be back.
Well, I want to thank you for having me on your show too.
Yeah.
You're actually one of my popular videos on here. The one time I had you on, a lot of people got a kick out of it. So glad to have you. So last time we had you on, you were talking about getting ready to watch the Democrat National Convention, and
Yes.
you had been reading Mein Kampf, and you might finish the book with comparison to what's going on with the Democratic Party. So how did that all turn out? Did you finish Mein Kampf yet? Did you watch the convention? Or?
I did watch the whole convention, except for like some of the musical numbers, and I did not catch Nancy Pelosi's speech. Mein Kampf, Mein Kampf, a lot of people don't know, it's split into two parts. I did read the first volume quite some time ago, and I wanted to have the second volume finished around the time that the Democrats were wrapping up their convention. But the problem is, I'm also reading the Bible right now, and in addition to watching the Democrat convention and the Republican convention next week, I really didn't need another incentive to commit suicide. It's just, you have to pace yourself a little bit, because Mein Kampf is a miserable book. It's basically a picture of Donald Trump's tweets were expanded into book form. The incoherence of the arguments, the grammatical errors, the pseudo-intellectual sentence structure. It's really painful to read. Usually not as painful as the Bible, but close. And in addition to that, the Democrat convention, I mean, that's 4 nights of it. I mean, the fact that it goes on, it was 8 hours of that convention stretched over 4 insufferable nights. It's pretty bruising, and especially for the soul. And the morning after the convention, I saw that Dinesh D'Souza is back with another documentary that's going to be coming out in October. Between that and the fact that I'm also working on rewatching the films of Michael Moore, I just can't punish myself that much. I say with my website, I suffer so you don't have to, but I can't be vulgar about it. Like, I can't. You got to have your limit. So no, we'll get to Mein Kampf eventually. But yes, I did sit through the insufferable Democrat National Convention. This was my first time watching a convention in its entirety over 4 nights, and it was about as bad as you would expect, but maybe not for the reasons that you would expect.
So what's your takeaway from it? It was bad, but was it what you were expecting to get from the Democrats, or was it worse, or what's your diagnosis of it?
Well, in a way, it's the Democrats' 4-night pity party. It's really self-pitying, it's self-aggrandizing, and it's self-indulgent. The thing is, this is happening at the same time that the NBA and the NHL have entered into their postseason. They're having the playoffs now. And I've said before that with these spectator sports that are being held without the spectators, it really takes away the artificial magic of it all. And you can see that it's just some overpaid, decadent man-child throwing a ball at a target and missing it at least as often as he hits it. And when you take away the madness of the crowd, it's stripped down to the inane event that it is. That was true of the Democrat convention as well. You saw how without the idiots in the crowd screaming, you lose that sense of mass euphoria, and you lose the incentive to surrender yourself to the madness. I haven't seen the ratings for this year's convention. I would imagine the ratings were down quite a bit, even though the culture has become hyper politicized, and I'm going to be talking about that in an article on my website soon. But I think that the way that they insisted on shoving these stars in people's faces without the sort of power that comes with having all of those thousands of idiots screaming their name, I think it really did expose how brutal it is. Yet somehow people were still tweeting about how much they enjoyed it. I mean, you didn't see quite as vocal enthusiasm for it as you may have in the past, but it is interesting how they felt that the public was still going to have some kind of natural interest in watching this.
Yeah, so do you think this is pretty reflective of what the Democratic Party is, what it's become? What is your overall opinion of that party in general, outside of the convention, just as an organization?
Well, it's a terribly outdated organization. I did publish a couple of articles at overwritten.org talking about what it's like to watch the convention, and what the convention is just mass media propaganda for the party. I kind of avoided using the word Democrat Party in my essays. I just called it the party, because I'm trying to. I think when you take away the specific ideological connotation and you remind yourself that this is just one political party among how many thousands have we seen throughout history, there's no reason why it deserves the prestige that it gets. I mean, why didn't the Libertarian Convention get that kind of primetime treatment on CNN? The almighty well, the almighty arm of Warner Media decides what is or is not relevant for the American people. And so the Democrats ran an incredibly overlong and ridiculously expensive primary season, all to lead towards the inevitable conclusion of Joe Biden defying the odds to become the nominee. I've made the joke before that Joe Biden is a pathetic representative of the so-called Progressive Party, because he claims to support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, but you know as well as I do that he's not going to fight for that. He certainly, especially if he has a Republican Congress, he doesn't support the legalization of marijuana. He doesn't support Medicare for all. I mean, there's nothing progressive about the man, and yet this is supposed to be the ideological alternative to Donald Trump. And so the Democrat Party, it would be irrelevant, but for the fact that the Democrats have done such a great job marketing themselves as the antithesis of the Republicans. I mean, you've probably read the articles explaining how the Republican Party has a serious youth problem and their voters are literally dying off rapidly by the year. I think what's going to happen eventually is you see Howie Hawkins infiltrating the Green Party. I think what may happen is the Green Party will go mainstream as the ostensibly leftist alternative to the Democrats, who will become the new Republican Party. Chris Hedges has said that Bill Clinton made the Democratic Party the Republican Party, and he made the Republican Party insane. I think Joe Biden will complete that process, where the Republican Party will be done away with, the Democrats will become the new conservatives, and the Green Party will supposedly fight for progressive values, but ultimately disappoint their supporters.
Yeah, so that word conservative, like so many words nowadays, I feel like it is a definitionless term.
Yeah.
Because
yeah, exactly.
At least fiscally, definitely, but I'd even say socially, and that would bring us into the Republican Party. When I look at the Republican Party, a lot of people are criticizing the Democratic Party for having no values anymore, except not being Trump. But the only value I see the Republicans supporting is being Trump. Yep. Like they've completely abandoned their family values, their fiscal responsibility, whatever it was they used to say they stood for. Now they've just taken Trump as their centerpiece of ideology. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about the Republican Party in general? And what do you think will happen if they lose? Because if Trump is all they stand for and Trump loses, maybe this kind of adds to your theory, or not your theory, but the theory you were just explaining about how the Republican Party will dissolve and the Democratic Party might have to become the new Republican Party. Because if Trump is your standard bearer of ideology and he loses, what do you stand for anymore, and what would the Republicans stand for?
Well, the Republicans have lost a lot of corporate support, and with good reason, because the Republican presidential nominee has won only one popular vote in the last 30 years. I mean, clearly, the party no longer represents the will of the people.
Right.
It doesn't even really attempt to anymore. But what's interesting is you explained how the Republicans have abandoned a lot of their so-called family values and their social values and all this other stuff. What I find interesting about that is when the Democrats complain about that and they say that the Republicans should not be, if they are social conservatives, they shouldn't be getting behind this womanizer, this vulgarian Donald Trump. What's interesting about that is they're not suggesting that Donald Trump is bad because he's a womanizer. They're saying that it's hypocritical of the Republicans to support him. So obviously Bill Clinton, the libertine, the Democrats are willing to look the other way with his wrongdoing. So what that means is the Republicans have in a way become social liberals, and they've beat the liberals at their own game. And by taking that, I'm not sure what you would call it, maybe this kind of willingness to be hip, by taking that away from the Democrats, the Republicans have beat them at their own game, which I find very interesting. It's like they were boxed into a corner, so they decided to just flip the board over and make up their own rules. That's why I talk about what the Democrats becoming the new conservative party. It seems like they already have no choice but to be conservative in an attempt to counter Trump's supposed immorality. Now, what will happen if the Republicans lose this time? You know, I have a friend who is not politically engaged at all. I actually do feel sorry for him because he's not able to cope with what's happening now with society deteriorating. He seems to believe that everything's going to go back to normal at some point, and I feel bad. But the thing is, we were talking about, or rather, he asked me how I felt about these claims that the Trump supporters, the trumpeters, would break out and try to fight a civil war if their man lost. We heard similar concerns about what these kinds of people, these alt-right folks, for lack of a better word, were going to do if Obama had won or if Obama had been reelected. But the difference is that the conservatives never liked, or the so-called conservatives, the far-right people, they never liked John McCain. That's why McCain had to pick Sarah Palin, a far-right vice presidential nominee. And they also didn't care about Mitt Romney. Their guy in 2012 was Newt Gingrich. So when the Republican nominee lost in those years, they didn't really have a whole lot of sentimental attachment to them. But this time around, they really like Trump. They like what he stands for. And to see him cut down, especially if they believe that the Democrats might have played some funny business, maybe they tried to stuff the ballots with mail-in voting. I'm not giving credence to any of those theories. I'm just saying that they might believe it. Right. You might see some violent protest, especially we've talked about what's going on at the arms dealers, how the guns are flying off the shelves, the ammo is disappearing. It does seem like they're getting ready for something. And I'm not suggesting that they could successfully mount a civil war, because they would be stomped down by the federal government quite quickly. But with what we see happening with the Black Lives Matter protests, they could think, hey, maybe it's our turn to indulge in a little bit of violent therapy, get a little cathartic. A civil war, I think, is a bridge too far. But you could see some violent reprisals if their guy, because he is their guy, were to get knocked out at the White House.
Yeah. So what do you view as the difference that's left between the Republicans and the Democrats? Is there any substantial difference? I think, in my opinion, they choose like 3 or 4 issues to convince their voters that they're polar opposites. So it would be abortion, guns, I guess maybe climate change, and maybe drugs. But even like drugs and gay marriage, those used to definitely be ones they used, but those are kind of fading away. So it's really down to like 3 issues. They convinced the public, we are polar opposites. These people are taking away your freedom. You need to vote for us if you want to have democracy. But most things, if you look at the voting records in Congress and what they push, it ends up being identical. So what is the difference between them, do you think? Is there any difference?
I wouldn't say that there's a substantial fundamental difference. There are certain superficial or rhetorical differences. The issue with drugs, by the way, the Republicans have lost that war. Regardless of what you think about drugs, there are two reasons why we're going to see more and more legal. There are three reasons actually why we'll see drugs become increasingly legalized over the next few years. Number one is that some states have already legalized it. So you have this ridiculous situation where it's illegal for me in New Hampshire to smoke marijuana within these political borders, but as soon as I cross over into the Massachusetts border, suddenly I can smoke it. That's legally incoherent. That's going to fall apart. Number two, as the federal government looks to rid itself of much of its current expenses, the DEA is obviously something that could be at best privatized, and so that's going to be seen as a superfluous expense. And number three, as the society deteriorates, people are going to need more and more ways to cope with it. They're going to need substances to get through the misery of unemployment and so on. And so that they're going to realize that just give the people their weed and let them, hopefully they'll keep quiet. I think the only real, I'm also, we won't get into it right now, but I'm not convinced that the Democrats are really as anti-gun as people like to think they are. I think that they are in certain major cities, but I think that as far as like a Democratic governor out here is not going to be interested in coming after my revolver. But the thing is that it seems that the only social issue where the Democrats actually do seem to have some kind of legitimate ideological difference from the Republicans is with abortion rights. But the thing is, the Democrats don't seem to defend those abortion rights particularly vigorously. One of the reasons that Obama was not allowed to put Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court was because the Republicans didn't want a pro-choice judge sitting on the bench. And the Democrats just accepted it. They just sort of shrugged their shoulders and allowed it to continue. I mean, they kicked up a fuss in the media, but what did they actually do about it? Brett Kavanaugh going to the Supreme Court, they made a big spectacle of their opposition on the news, but during televised proceedings, but they didn't actually take any extraordinary measures to bar him. And in fact, several Democrats in swing states were allowed by the party to vote in favor of his nomination. So I'm not convinced that there really is a remarkable difference here. It seems to me that as Wall Street has assumed more and more control over election financing, that the differences have faded away. I mean, I think it was in 2012 that Obama had more corporate support, more support from Wall Street than Mitt Romney, and that's because the tone of the Democrats is obviously more appealing to larger sections of the country, particularly younger people. These old white so-called conservatives who love Donald Trump, I mean, they are dying off. They're reaching the ends of their lives, and there's no reason to think that that kind of political style can continue. So it's better to have somebody like Joe Biden, and also the media will cover for a lot of the civil unrest that would take place under a Biden administration. So is there a difference? I don't believe that there is a significant fundamental difference. I think that there are some people in the Democratic Party who have better intentions than most of the Republicans, but at the same time, they're not able to bring those ideas to fruition. They're not able to get any legislation passed in support of what they want.
Yeah, I agree. So the reason I feel comfortable being a libertarian is that, to me, it's the only ideology that wants to remove the government's power over your life and wants to remove the government's power of destroying countries all over the world. It's the only consistent ideology that removes all these horrible structures that exist. Like, every single other party supports them in one way or the other, and you might have good candidates, like Ron Paul or somebody like that within those parties who differs with the core of that ideology of that party, but for the most part, that's how they are. So I know you have past friendliness toward libertarianism with Ron Paul. What is your view on the libertarian philosophy nowadays? What do you think of it?
Well, it's a philosophy that's becoming increasingly difficult to articulate to people, because the thing is that we talk quite a bit about the progressive media. I mean, a lot of people would probably lump your show in with the progressive media just because it's acknowledging the evil duopoly that we're dealing with right now. But you're obviously not a progressive. You don't believe in certain things like the like universal Medicare or things like that. Nevertheless, people would call you a progressive. And so when you try to articulate your philosophy, it's going to horrify a lot of the progressives who are really no more than reactionary socialists. They're going to think it's barbaric that we would eliminate the Department of Education because when a mainstream politician talks about abolishing the DOE, he or she is usually doing it for the wrong reasons. It's because they want it to be privatized and they want people to be forced to pay for the private service that is going to replace public education. Ron Paul, I remember, had that famous ad where he said he was going to cut the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, HUD, and these proposals are shocking to a lot of people because it is true that if we just ripped out those institutions overnight and just said to the people, you're on your own, all hell would break loose. So libertarianism it doesn't advocate for just throwing them away and being done with them. It explains how we create an alternative system that does not coerce people into supporting it, whether through the government or through almighty private corporations. So libertarianism is I think it's sort of it's losing its oxygen in the modern day because within the independent media, there's room only for QAnon and progressivism, and there isn't room for a whole lot else. So libertarianism is something that will probably, you see, it's weird because even though we would think that libertarianism would rapidly be on its way out, the Libertarian Party actually tends to get a lot more support at the presidential level than the Green Party. It's very interesting how I think Gary Johnson had 4 times as many votes as Jill Stein did in 2016, and yet Jill Stein is blamed for throwing the election to Trump. I mean, maybe that's sexism on the part of the Democrats, I don't know. But I think there's also an incentive to ignore how powerful the Libertarian Party is. At least relative to the Green Party. So is a generational shift going to be the undoing of the Libertarian Party, or does the Libertarian Party continue to grow within the circles that it has? The Libertarian Party seems to know when to stay out of the public arena, though, unlike the Greens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is I agree with you that all those hurdles exist for the libertarians. But since you yourself are an educated person and you understand those ideas, what do you personally actually think of them now?
Well, see, I tend to identify with anarchy, but that I think is a very optimistic view of human potential. I think that anarchy is wrongly characterized as a pessimistic or nihilistic philosophy. I think it's actually too optimistic, even for my own taste. But it would be, it would obviously the best of all possible ideals. So in the absence of that, I tend to agree with Peter Schiff, who said that he made the argument for government as humanity has a vacuum for potential leadership. And so rather than allow that vacuum to be filled by a potentially nefarious force, we should create something in order, as flawed as it is, to prevent something worse from coming in its place. And so that's where I would sign on with libertarianism. I do believe, for example, with the Department of Education, clearly the Department of Education has been very, very wasteful. We did have public education prior to the creation of that department, which came under Carter, I believe. And the cost of education has just risen considerably. And Peter Schiff tried to articulate this during Occupy Wall Street, but people didn't want to hear it. You could also argue that the Environmental Protection Agency just produces a lot of paperwork and doesn't actually do anything to save the environment. That wouldn't surprise me. I actually worked for a government agency at one point that was supposed to be working towards disability rights, and it was just a bunch of sinecures. They never actually did anything besides occasionally they would be called in to see if an event was true, if a venue was truly accessible before some politician made a speech. So yeah, libertarianism. I would. That is the political philosophy to which I would sign on if I was trying to make a mainstream position. It would be wonderful if we could get to a point where, like education. I got lost there for a second. Education should not be mandated by the state, because we're seeing this we're seeing the problem with this come up now with the pandemic, is that there are all of these restrictions on what children can do in these public schools, where they're going to be forced to wear masks, or the schools won't even be open. But because parents are required to ensure that their children receive some kind of education, they're put in this impossible spot where they can't, they're handcuffed and prevented from doing anything. So libertarianism provides a solution to that with like homeschooling or things of that sort. I think it's also possible to have universal health care within a libertarian system. It just wouldn't be mandated by the state, and it wouldn't be financed through the extortion of taxation.
Yeah, I've actually made that identical argument. So what type of so what would, in your you were just saying that anarchy is too idealist of a system to actually work. What would the government...
Not that it couldn't work, that it's probably unrealistic. It is possible, but it's unrealistic.
Gotcha. So what do you think the libertarian outline of what the government should do is accurate? Do you think it should mostly just be things that people would not be able to handle without oversight? So you need some sort of universal law that protects people's rights, that if you left it up to individual states or towns, they might violate those rights, and, you know, like a military force or courts that are overseeing everybody. What do you think the government, the federal government, should consist of? And as you said, if we didn't have it, it would be filled with maybe a tyrannical government. Like, I think you might be, I think I've seen the interview you're talking about. It's Adam Kokesh talking with Peter Schiff about that very idea. And Peter Schiff says that if we didn't draw distinct lines around what the government's role would be, that it would inevitably be filled by something much worse. So what would those lines be, do you think?
Well, actually, Peter Schiff has probably talked about that issue in other places, like the interview you just mentioned, which I have not watched. Okay. He mentioned it years ago in a debate with Stefan Molyneux, whose YouTube channel has now been destroyed. That's a whole different kettle of fish. But they were talking, just briefly, they were talking about whether all taxation is theft. And Peter Schiff, I think, proved that it's not, because he gave the example of a toll on a bridge. And if you don't want to pay for the cost of the bridge, then don't take the bridge. And I don't see how it's different if a private person or an individual owns the bridge as opposed to a government. I mean, either way, you have to pay for the toll. So it's not inherently immoral. Tariffs are not inherently immoral, but we can get at a different time. So the question about what should the government do, I think that one of the issues is that we've allowed these tyrannical governments to grow to such force that perhaps a truly libertarian system has become impractical just because of the threat that imperialism poses, whether it's from the United States or elsewhere. One thing, for example, so you asked, what should the federal government provide? Well, first, you have to ask the question, should the United States exist in the form that it does right now? I would argue that with this landmass and with this heterogeneity of cultures, perhaps the United States is just too large in its present form. Perhaps it would be more effective if we had a kind of federation of regions, I suppose, where if like New England had its own autonomous government, and then perhaps parts of the South had their own autonomous government, and you see where I'm going with this, and then they would all kind of like an American Union, as opposed to one federal government trying to solve the problems of all the different regions. I understand that the corruption of Wall Street is the real issue and not the size of the the sizes of the government. But at the same point, I think that approach would probably be more effective, because then the people who live in California, their values would not have to be compromised with the values of the people living in Mississippi. The Deep South could have their own autonomous government. And then I think it would be easier to determine what should the government do. But if there was a way to create a kind of unifying government, I take the military, for example. I don't believe that all of these branches of the military are actually necessary. In a libertarian system, pretty much the only military force that you would actually need is a National Guard, because you're defending yourself. You're not going on the offense. It's possible that certain elements of the other branches, like the Navy, for example, could be rolled into the National Guard. The National Guard would be bigger than it is today, but it wouldn't be the size of the military as it exists right now. I would abolish the Marines, for example. The Army could be largely abolished. Certain elements of the Air Force would be rolled into the National Guard. But that is, like, in a military context, what the federal government ought to do, at least in my perspective. As for things like managing gun laws, for example, this is something that's best left up to the region in question. I understand why in certain areas people might want to live without guns, and so that is where they can create their own rules. Like down in Massachusetts, I can't bring my guns into Massachusetts. It's kind of annoying, but then again, I don't need to force my way of living onto Massachusetts, and vice versa. When the people from Massachusetts come up here, then they can use the guns that are up here. So I don't, a lot of these things don't need to be solved at the federal level, which is part of the dysfunction of the political system that we have right now. And the political crisis we have right now is we're looking for a president who can satisfy the coastal ideologies and the Deep South simultaneously, and that person does not exist. Like you could try to create that kind of politician like a Mr. Potato Head, and it just wouldn't work. I mean, it's not going to happen. So leaving it up to the regions would probably be the best thing. And then what do you have as like a sort of who takes the true central power? I don't know, but it's a person who's not going to be allowed to do very much. In my ideal, if I had to try to make the United States an ideal, that would be my approach. But I would like to begin with a much smaller region.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that decentralization idea. So given the political landscape we have now, the overreaching government we have, do you think it's counterproductive to get involved with the system? Do you think, voting libertarian is a waste of time, or that it's even hypocritical because you're getting involved in a system that is the opposition to libertarian values? Or do you think it's this oppressive state has gotten so big that just removing yourself from the equation doesn't do any good because they still control your life, and so you need to have people fighting against that system? What is your approach to that? I mean, you seem to have you're still very critical, but you seem to have kind of backed away from being involved in a political sense as far as pushing for certain people or certain parties. So how do we go forward, in your opinion?
Well, it's not hypocritical to vote. I've been drinking a Dunkin' Donuts coffee the whole time we've been doing this interview, and while I'm complaining about corporations, I'm not suggesting that every single service offered by every single corporation is inherently evil. There's the Dunkin' Donuts right down the street from my house. Those people there are very friendly to me when I come in. They have to work too, so I don't mind going in once in a while and spending $3 on a coffee. And if that's a sin, then I'll deal with it in purgatory. Well, seriously, I mean, it's like, is that really is buying that one coffee really the most egregious offense possible within my power? No. So here's my thing with the third parties, and this is something that's really irritating me as I see it on Twitter quite a bit. I don't have a problem with third party candidates or nominees operating as basically public educators, where their political campaign is really just more of a public speaking tour. Like, for example, I interviewed Ian Schlachman, who was running for the nomination of the Green Party. He explained, and he made it quite clear, that the Green Party understands completely that they're not going to win this election.
Right.
Jo Jorgensen, I hope, knows that she's not going to win this election. And so I don't have a problem with them running if they're taking that kind of intellectual approach to it. What I don't like to see are these third-party candidates who are soliciting massive donations, particularly in the time of the pandemic, for what is ultimately a failed campaign. Joshua for Congress was a good example if you saw what happened to him. He had a massive Twitter following, probably made quite a bit of money creating a brand for himself, and he got trounced in his primary. I believe it was out in Washington State. I took some issue with Jen Perelman in Florida. I think she knew full well that she did not stand a chance of taking down a very powerful oligarch like Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but she was more than willing to create this brand for herself, go on Joe Rogan's show while not even responding to my interview, requesting an interview. And so the question is, what did she do with those campaign contributions? I've got the same question for that guy, Batar, I believe his name is, who's running against Nancy Pelosi. You know as well as I do that the Democrats will pull out all the stops to make sure that Nancy Pelosi does not win that election. I mean, excuse me, that she does not lose that election. Yeah. Right, excuse me. That'll be used against me, but whatever. But the point is, so I don't have a problem with Batar running against Pelosi to raise awareness of what is actually wrong with the Democratic Party or with the political system in general. What I have a problem with is if he's going to be soliciting mass donations just so he can profit off of a campaign while lying to people and telling them that he has a chance. And Jo Jorgensen has been writing quite a bit about when I am president, but you know she's not going to win. Right. So you have to have that kind of cynical honesty about you if you're going to launch those third-party campaigns. And actually, I know that Perelman was, I don't think all of them were running third-party, but you know what I mean. It's the same concept in general. So that I don't have a problem with people going out and voting. I don't even have a problem with people voting for the lesser of two evils. What I have a problem with is the voter shaming that is going on right now. And I have to look in the mirror and I have to ask myself, did I become indignant about people voting for Joe Biden as the lesser of two evils? Because if I believe, as I always have, that the votes don't actually matter, then a vote for Biden doesn't actually matter. My protest vote for Julian Assange doesn't matter any more or less than a vote for Biden. And so I don't have a problem with people voting. What I have a problem with are these politicians who know damned well that voting isn't going to make a difference, who are going out and endorsing Joe Biden and claiming that the streets are going to be paved with gold if he takes over. That was my issue with Bernie Sanders and with a certain other person we could mention but won't. It's that lying that I don't like, and that's what was so repulsive about the Democrat National Convention. It was 8 hours of people lying. Like, these weren't just random bums off the street who have been tricked into thinking that the Democrats are the good guys. These are highly educated individuals who understand the cynical and fatalistic reality of the political system that we have, and yet they're not telling the truth, and it's sickening. Right. It's sickening. That's what I didn't like about I remember when I went and I asked all those presidential candidates how they felt about Assange. I thought it was better when Andrew Yang just flat out said, I'm not going to pardon him. I thought that was better than when Cory Booker was giving that horrible lie saying he doesn't know anything about the case. Cory Booker is one of Hillary Clinton's closest allies. He was on her shortlist for VP back in 2016. He knows everything about the WikiLeaks case. Right. And I just, that dishonesty, it's like, why do people have to lie? That's what I don't like about it. If you want to vote, I'm going to vote. But I also understand what exactly I'm dealing with. Just if we could just tell the truth, we would be rid of a lot of these problems.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to ask you is I've been watching your show quite a bit, and you have pretty pessimistic futures for our country in your estimation. You're talking about how our economy is falling apart, how you think the United States as a country is not going to exist the way it does today anymore. And I agree with a lot of those things. And I'm going to have to come on your show and talk about economic collapse at a certain point. But
Yes,
I wanted to get your opinion of what the short-term future looks like for the United States. Do you think we're headed for a currency collapse? Do you think our empire is going to finally fold? And
yes.
is that a good thing? Are you hoping that happens? Because I honestly, even though we're going to suffer through it, I am hoping that it happens because it'll be a stain on the world that'll finally be gone.
Well, you ask if I hope it's going to happen. It's already happening right now as we speak. People have always, like, when we get into like the prepper culture, people talking about when is the United States going to collapse, like Rome did. Rome didn't collapse overnight. They didn't just wake up one day and realize, oh, everything's gone to hell. It took place over a period of, I believe it was like the decline is usually described as a period of at least a century, if not considerably more than that. One of the things I've been doing is I've been watching a lot of films that were released within the last 20 or 30 years. And you can see in these films that there is a profound horror at what American culture had become at that point. Just to use a quick example, I think everybody should watch this film if they haven't already. They definitely need to watch it in the present moment. American Beauty, which won Best Picture in 1999, was a film that it confused conservatives and liberals loved it. Well, go back and watch that film, which was not some obscure movie. It was a very mainstream film. And you can see that the film is a slamming indictment of the American culture. Now, if that is a grotesque reflection of our so-called American values, what kind of hope did that film express 21 years ago for the direction in which society was heading? And you can come up with a million examples. These were warning signs that we just didn't pick up on at the time because we thought that we could live in the state of dysfunction forever. We thought that we could have our cake and eat it too. And that's something that I have been struggling with quite a bit in the time of the pandemic, is you can see that the society is decaying quite rapidly, perhaps a bit too rapidly for anybody's comfort. And I suppose I had always convinced myself that I wasn't going to have to live to see any of this, that I would see only the beginnings of the wobbling of the empire when I was in my old age. Now, so it is happening. Saying, do I hope it happens, I think is anachronistic. I think that we're already living in it. Do I hope it gets worse? Well, the thing is, there are a bunch of innocent people who are suffering because of this and who are going to continue to suffer much more severely. I mentioned earlier my friend who has no clue about what's happening right now. Is it his fault for failing to educate himself? Well, maybe, but at the same time, like, certainly he doesn't need to be punished in the same way that the oligarchs would. Right. So seeing him like lose his job or whatever is not going to be a pleasant thing, and I'm not going to be like laughing and as this is like divine retribution or something like that. I don't like that, and that's just one example. There's going to be people who suffer a lot more. So no, I don't say that I am. I wouldn't say that I'm pleased or excited for the collapse of the empire, because it's not going to be like a Mad Max film. It's not going to be this enjoyable voyage through the scorched post-apocalyptic landscape. It's going to be really painful for a lot of people. But ultimately, as a source of so much of the needless suffering in the world, ultimately the empire does have to be done away with, just like the French Empire was done away with. And as that was documented in Les Miserables, America has had her time, and now she's in the twilight of her life.
Yeah, no, I think that's articulated well, and I agree. I mean, I want people in the United States to prepare themselves for what is coming. And as you alluded to, I think it is going to be more rapid than a lot of us had previously thought. Everything is sped up nowadays compared to the way, say, the Roman Empire fell. So I am not looking forward to the pain that we as Americans are going to have to endure, but I think it's a necessary step to finally get rid of this unsustainable system that we've been propped up upon, and the entire world has been suffering from it. So I think it's a necessary step forward, but I think there are ways that the American people can prepare themselves for this, and even our government could make steps that would make this not as a root of an awakening, because we are just headed toward a brick wall at 80 miles per hour and we're just stomping on the accelerator. I think we're going to hit the wall regardless now, but we could at least put our seatbelts on and start pressing the brake pedal. But I want to thank you for coming on again. And as I said earlier, thanks for having me on your show several times so far.
Yeah.
So I'll just give you the last word if there's anything you want to say, if you want people to follow you or.
Yeah, they can follow me on Twitter at Dack Rouleau, but at overwritten.org, that's my website. I've been writing quite a bit about these things. I've been able to pick up on my reading again lately, and I've been doing quite a bit of sort of exploratory articles about where the signs of where society is heading, analyzing propaganda. And we've got some good stuff coming next week. There's going to be an article about the idea that we are not impacting the media is controlling our lives. There's also going to be a piece analyzing intellectual suppression on CNN, and even going to be examining some of the really creepy propaganda that was on Bill Maher this last week. So we got some good stuff coming.
All right, guys, go check it out. I'll put links in the description to the Overwritten Report and to his YouTube channel and his Twitter page. So go give him a follow. He's got good content. He's had a lot of interesting people on as well. So go check him out. And thanks for tuning in, everyone. And thanks for coming on, Dack.
Thank you.